French Revolution, George Washington, the fall of the Roman Empire, the American Civil War, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Tiananmen Square, the Irish Troubles. These are people and events we all know. But how much do we know about our own history? The answer, not a lot. And that's worrying, because we are at a breaking point in Australia. We lack social cohesion and unity in a world that looks very different from one day to the next. So, how did we get here? I want to talk to some of the brightest minds in Australia and answer that exact question. We'll talk the past, the politics, the challenges we've faced, and the ones yet to come, to figure out how we got here and where we'll go. I'm David Thom, and this is How We Got Here. Julianne Shultz is an emeritus professor at Griffith University of Media and Culture, but she is so much more than that. She was the founding editor of the Australian literary and current affairs journal Griffith Review. She's been an academic, a journalist, an author, and a columnist for The Guardian. In 2022, she wrote a book called The Idea of Australia, A Search for the Soul of the Nation. It's a poetic and philosophical dive into what our nation is, was, and can be. It's deeply personal, yet taps into something larger. What does it mean to be a nation, to honour and respect one's history, to embrace shame and guilt? In 2025, SBS turned the book into a documentary series with some of Australia's leading minds. And now, Julianne joins me to discuss what our identity is and what it means. Because although this book came out 4 years ago, there are very few people who have queried and articulated our nation's soul better. Julianne, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, David.
Now, you wrote a whole book about Australian identity and where it came from. How would you describe it?
Oh, look, that's a really hard question. And when the leader of the opposition talks about the Australian way of life, which is his new slogan, which is an IPA, Institute of Public Affairs campaign, the Australian way of life, I think, can somebody please ask him what he means? What does he mean when he says the Australian way of life? Look, I think that it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, people come from somewhere, and although we operate very much in a global world, where we come from and what we understand of the place really shapes who we are and how we think and what we do. And that's not it's not a crude sort of nationalism. It's just about you are from somewhere and that's what gives you the grounding. And so I think that for different people who lived in Australia at different times, obviously there are quite different sort of understandings of what that means. I think I was very lucky. I mean, I was born in the late 1950s, so I grew up through the 60s and 70s. And so I grew up through a period where things were changing, things were being revealed. You know, stuff that had never been known suddenly became known. And it was, I'd say in the book at one point, it's like the dance of the seven veils. You know, you take one off and, oh, there's something else there. Oh, there's something else. You know, so the notion of it being a nation that has been crafted is something that I'm very conscious of. And I increasingly came to realise that nothing happened without a fight. And that there was always an argument. And even if we landed somewhere that, you know, I may have felt uncomfortable with, there'd been people arguing for something else long before that. And so often it takes a long time for those arguments to actually deliver the goods. And so I guess what I was trying to do was to try and think about what it means to be Australian in a long continuum of how stuff gets revealed. And as you learn more, you can get a better sense of it. So for me, being Australian is not about driving a ute and going and, you know, doing oi, oi, oi stuff. But I understand how for some people that's really an essential part of it. I think it's an open-mindedness, a generosity of spirit and a willingness to be curious and embrace things. Now, that's obviously not always in evidence, but that's, for me, the best bit about it.
I'm really glad you brought up the part about an argument, because I love this book, and I think you so eloquently put so many things that I was kind of thinking at the time and being like, wow, that's a really good way to put it. But on that point of the argument, you have this line: ever since this makeshift settlement was established in 1788, there have been contests between people and ideas, between individualism and collective good. And I think those are two really important themes in both the book and Australian history, is that kind of argument between individualism and collective good. Do you think there is something unique about our Australian approach to those two kind of conflicting concepts?
Look, that's a really good question. Whether it's unique or whether it's just played out in its own, you know, sort of makeshift sort of way. But I think the fact that there's been a tension is really, really, really important. And because the people who are arguing for what I guess we'd sort of loosely say is a sort of progressive view have, they've won some, they've lost some, they've lost more, that it often takes a long time for those sort of essentially good ideas, which are based on a collective thing, to actually make their way forward. One of the things, and it's been there, as you say, quoting that bit from the book, it's been there right from the earlier settlement. There were people who wanted to have a better relationship with the First Peoples, that was something that was really very actively argued for. There was... there was a real debate around things right from the very beginning. But we've sort of not been good at remembering those things,
Right.
the good bits. And so, one of the stories that I quite like is, that the struggle, for instance, to end convict transportation, was a huge campaign. And it was won, and convict transportation to the eastern colonies stopped in 1850 or whatever it was. Now, that should be a day that we absolutely celebrate. That is a real marking of a society that said, actually, we don't want to be the place you send your convicts to, in the way that the settlement was first established. That should be a really marking. Anyway, that was a pretty big achievement. But people wouldn't even know about it. It's just completely become invisible. So I think that contest is very present. The uniqueness stuff, I don't know. That's a hard question. I don't think I can answer that. I have to write another book on that.
Because I definitely felt it when I've gone through school and turned 18 and stuff, and I was like, what is the idea of being an Australian? What does it mean? And then you travel and you go overseas and you talk to other people and you meet other people, and they're like, they kind of define it for you.
Yeah.
They kind of can see in you what it means to be an Australian, because it's not what they're used to.
Yeah.
I wonder, do you think as a country we've discussed what our identity means more than any other country? Because I don't know, do you see the Americans and the Brits discussing like what it means to be American or British in the same way we do?
No, I don't. And I think that, like the Brits have been absolutely hopeless at discussing, the legacies of colonisation and empire. Like absolutely hopeless. Until relatively recently, they just didn't even acknowledge, that happened and that reshaped their society. It just couldn't do it. The Americans go back to their sort of founding principles and rehash them. And we sort of, I think there's waves of discussing and talking and debating what it means to be Australian. And you saw it in that sort of pre-Federation period where there's a really intense discussion about what sort of society did you want to create, what sort of place did it want to be. And there were a lot of sort of really, really good ideas that didn't get up, whether there should be a Bill of Rights, whether citizenship should be defined, whether women should have the vote, whether there should be recognition of First Nations people. Those debates were very live, but then once the settlements reached, you don't actually talk about it anymore. In that period after the Second World War, it's a very active sort of discussion about what it meant to be Australian. Certain things happened, the migration stuff happened, the reconstruction of the economy happened, but then it doesn't get talked about much anymore. And then you get to the sort of 70s period and it happens again. And when John Howard became Prime Minister in 1996, he said something like, people are sick of the endless seminar on Australian identity. Let's stop doing that. And he very effectively did stop that conversation. And it was just, in my view, starting to get to a point, because by that stage, the true import of the sort of the treatment of First Nations people was becoming very clear. The treatment of women, like all of those things were very much in the public discussion. And by stopping that conversation, we're now in a position where everyone's got their own little bit of an idea, but we've actually forgotten about how you actually have that bigger conversation. And I think that's, we're seeing it playing out now in the sort of whole social cohesion debate, that we're not, because we've lost the language to talk about it beyond best little multicultural country in the world, we've actually forgotten how to do that. And so I think finding the tools to do it in a way that goes beyond a politician saying, Australia's the greatest country in the earth. Well, actually, it's not. It's a work in progress. And so I think that programs like yours and, things like part of the reason I was doing the book and the TV show is just to try and trigger a conversation that says, actually, I don't know the answers to all these questions, but we've got to sort of try and work it out together.
Why do you think it is? Why do you think it is that we haven't talked about our history, even between the good and the bad? The Americans, they talk about the history all the time.
Absolutely.
Why do you think as a country we've kind of chosen to not look back or look in?
Look, I do think that Howard period shut down a lot of discussion and just said, don't, let's not talk about it anymore. It's too whatever. I think that was a quite deliberate political strategy, and I think, and Howard himself has said this, that he wanted to create something which people could hang on to. So the sort of glorification of the First World War and the sort of whole Anzac tradition was something that people could hang on to without going into the more messy, complicated stuff. So I think that deliberate effort to shut down a discussion has really been quite important. Of course, it coincided with the sort of internationalisation of the economy as well. So people, and young people especially, think I'm a citizen of the world. I can go anywhere, I can do whatever I like. This is a big open world, and I'll find my place. But the sort of economic structure became much more globalised as well. So talking about something that was particularly Australian it just became more difficult because there weren't a lot of the prompts around. The sort of early stages of the culture wars, attacking the sort of creation of Australian film and literature, public broadcasting, all of those sorts of things made it more difficult. It seemed to be oppositional rather than mainstream. And then, of course, the other bit of that is that during that period from 96 to now, the population has increased hugely, and we've not really, because we've not kept having that conversation with the intensity that we needed to, we haven't actually put out the lines that make it possible for other people to both understand what went on before, but also to find their way of really engaging with something that's unique. One of the things that it was a sort of an image that stays in my mind, is that, when you're in a big airport, like one of the ones in the Middle East that you no longer go to, and there's those endless, travelator things, you stand on with your bag. And it depends where you get on. Like if you get on at point A, you get to see the whole journey. If you get on at point Z or, point F down there, you see a very different part of the journey. And I think because of Australia being a settlement society, it's a bit like that. I got on, in the late 1950s. Well, you got on, a long time later. And what you see is quite different because you don't know what's gone before, really. Well,
there's something interesting in that, because how do you create an idea and an identity if every single decade so many new people come with their own ideas and identity of what it means to even just be human? We've had, you have the waves of colonization and then the waves of post-war migration and gold rush migration. How do you keep a constant identity through that? And it almost feels like that would be something that a Howard or a conservative Prime Minister would jump for, to be like, even if you come to this country, you got to have an Australian identity. You got to understand what Australia means. But we've failed to do that. Almost shutting down the conversation has led to that.
Well, and I think that we got caught up, like the big innovations, in sort of cultural exchange and political innovations, in the 70s, and into the 80s and then on a bit, were really profound. It was there in literature, it was there in film, it was there in music, it was there in, all that sort of creative space. But it was there in political things as well. It was there in Australia increasingly taking a position as a sort of third power, a middle power, exercising its authority, being sort of innovative in, like areas of women's rights and gay rights and environment and so on. I mean, all of those things were really, really important part of Australia. So, look, I think that in closing some of that discussion down, it was an attempt to hold on to a much simpler notion of Australia. And in fact, it was much more complicated. And that was a bit threatening for people, who'd been, who were comfortable in an old way of seeing things. And so, I mean, the example that I'd sort of point to in a way was that when the current Prime Minister Albanese, announced on his election victory night that he wanted to have the referendum into a meaningful recognition of Aboriginal First Nations people, and that the voice would be put up for a referendum. Now, at one level, that was, he'd said it during the campaign. It wasn't, it shouldn't have been a surprise, and at one level, and he says this in his sort of interviews, following the anniversary of his election, the last time, he said it was a request that came from the First Nations people after the constitutional convention that they had at Uluru, and so it was the right thing to do. But what he failed to do as Prime Minister, in my view, was he failed to make it about all of us. It wasn't just about giving Aboriginal and First Nations people recognition in a way that they were seeking, but it was actually about the whole country. It was about the whole country recognising that this was something that was truly unique, this sort of 65,000 years of civilisations. That was something really special and unique, and it actually touches us all. And I thought that sort of bifurcation, in a sense, that they asked for it and I'm trying to do it for them, and it's a good thing, missed the bigger argument, which is until Australia as a nation can actually come to terms with what that means, what that ancient history is, how it affects contemporary life, how it's come at such an enormous cost and at great benefits as well. Unless you can actually deal with that, you haven't got the baselines right for having a big conversation about what it means to be Australian, because you're still denying something which is so integral to it. So that's a long way around from your question, but you can see how my mind's going into that sort of space, that you've got to, until you can actually recognise what makes the place unique, at its core, it is that ancient story, those ancient peoples and those ancient ways of doing things still here, and then you've got the sort of settlement processes that have followed since. You've got to actually have that whole perspective when you're coming up with something that is about the place.
Maybe if you were Prime Minister, it would have been a whole lot better situation. I really feel that, because I look at, even if you look at New Zealand, and it's a completely different place with a completely different colonial history, although we like to think of ourselves as very similar nations, and you look at the way they do the haka at the start of every rugby game, right? And that's something we couldn't imagine doing in Australia. Right. And obviously we're on a continent of hundreds of nations rather than one nation that existed here before it. But you talk about that in the book as well, about having that unresolved history and how it will always burn within us if we don't have a treaty on this. And I think this relates to another thing that I've thought about a bit. We're in Sydney, where I don't think there's a city like Sydney where every single suburb has a different, like, ethnic, cultural, identity to it. You have Portuguese in Petersham, you have the Italians in Haberfield, and it stretches to every single suburb. You can label it. Is that in that combining of our ancient history, every single one of our waves of settlement that have ended up in their own communities instead of a broader community. Do you think there is a story, an identity that can unite us as a people rather than divide us in the way that we see now with our lack of social cohesion?
Well, I think there is, and I think that to find the pathways into that, you need to know some of the backstories. So you need to know the stories about the Lebanese who came here at the end of the 19th century, for instance. That there are great processes of migration. I mean, one of the just because my family heritage is German, I was sort of always interested in what was that story, and so there obviously the German settlers who came into South Australia very early on and established, they were sort of religious refugees in many ways. But then you've got, sort of two or three in the 19th century, two or three other waves of German migration. So you've got the people who've come as religious refugees. You've got the people like my father's family who came essentially on a land gift, that they bought, they got a fair and they got a bit of land and then they had to clear the land, and God help us. Then you've got the sort of industrialist crowd who came because they saw a way of making money and innovating and doing sort of, business stuff. And then you've got the sort of intellectuals who came after the revolution in 1848 had failed, and they saw a way of creating a new society in a place like Australia. And so so there's this whole sort of really rich tradition of different ways, the different baggage that people brought with them, that they leave a different thing along the way. Now, I thought that one of the things that it's a story that I tell in the book, but one of the things that was really striking in the First World War, so you've got about 5 to 7% of the population has a German history in Australia at that point. So it's quite high. And they obviously were white, so they weren't excluded in the sort of White Australia policy process. But come the First World War, many of them, including people who had been born in this country, were interned and put in constant, detention camps during that period. At the end of that period, at the end of this First World War, there was then a determination to deport these German Australians and people who were, travellers who'd got picked up along the way, back to Germany. It took until about 1922, I think, to get enough boats to send these German Australians back to Germany. Many of them had never been there before, and to re-establish a life. So this sort of process of deportation and moving, and you can't be here, but hey, you've been here since 1848, and you're, like your nephew was fighting in the First World War on the Australian side, but your family's being sent back to a devastated country. So I think that there's lots of stories, when you talk about these different sort of ethnic group and communities, there are lots of stories that go back, a long way that people need to know about. I mean, I was down at Bondi a couple of days after the shooting, and just by chance, I happened to be there. And I thought, do I want to go? And I walked around, and there was a choir singing a beautiful sort of shalom song. It was lovely. And all of a sudden there's this shouting, what are you doing in Parliament? What are you doing in Parliament? And it was Pauline Hanson and Barnaby Joyce had turned up, and they were addressing the crowd and saying, they would sort out whatever this problem was. And it was quite confronting, it was just like, this is a grief-stricken sight, and you've got these people making political hay out of it. And I walked up after the talk, and there was that group of Sikhs who does food tents, and they were handing out food to people who were there. And he said, "Oh, do you want a banana, or do you want a curry, or whatever?" And I said, "No." I said, "What do you think when you hear Pauline Hanson talking like that?" And he said, "Well, she means that I shouldn't be here. This is a guy in a turban and stuff. That means I shouldn't be here." And I said, "Well, yeah, that's exactly what she's saying." He said, "But this is ridiculous. There have been Sikhs in Australia since the 1850s. I've done the history. I know it." So finding the pathways that say, actually, there is a really rich, diverse history in this place that means that everyone can find a bit of a place that, I just think that's really exciting. It's really interesting.
I think so as well. And I think I don't know it off the top of my head, but there's a quote from Ronald Reagan, of all people, about how if you move to Germany, you won't be a German. If you move to France, it doesn't make you a French. But if you move to America, you'll always be American, no matter where you came from. And that was something unique about America. Recently, I don't know if that's still true with everything that's going on over there, but I've felt that the same here, is that your identity kind of fades. It doesn't fade away. You can keep being who you want to be, but like that Australian title, it's not something that you just get anymore from being white.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
If your parents are born here, you're born here, that makes you Australian in a way that they don't have that same kind of European way to it.
Yeah. And I think that's, and it's one of the sort of one of the problems of sort of identity politics stuff, that's been going on for the last little while, is that you have to choose one identity. And the thing that strikes me is that people have multiple different identities. They are different. There are different parts of their story, their history, who they are, that they draw on in different circumstances. Now, sure, at some time, this part of me is more important than that, but it's that sort of layering, which is, like, this is a society of layering, and that's a unique bit of the strength.
Okay, so let's break down some of the topics that you kind of go over in the book about. I want to look at each of the kind of values or markers of identity that we use in Australia. So let's start with mateship, right? In your book, you have this line, which I found really interesting. The dirty little truth about the Australian attachment to fairness is that it's always been partial. It was a bit like mateship. You choose your mates. You look out for them rather than commitment to an all-encompassing principle like of the French, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Do you think that's true? Do you think that mateship is by nature excludes?
Well, I think there's been a fair bit of mateship that's excluded, yes, absolutely. And I think, it's sort of very maleness, it's an exclusionary thing as well, that mateship is something that happens between blokes, it's not. So, look, I think you choose your mates. I do think that that's true. And of course there are random circumstances that throw you into proximity with somebody else and they become your mate because, by chance exposure. I think that the fairness thing is, I think when you talk about values in Australia and you look at the sort of international surveys of values and you hear it then when your politicians talk about things like, well, it's the faith in the rule of law. Well, I don't think that's a value. That's either, that's the nature of the structural thing. The rule of law is a structural thing. It's not a value.
But us being sticklers for the rules, what about that?
Well, sticklers for the rules, it's a survival thing, I think. I think that comes out of a sort of survivalist mentality, and I do think that, I was just going to say, the notion of fairness is one which is fairly unique in Australia. And I think that there's a long history that follows that through, and we can talk about that. So people are very sensitive to fairness and very aware when something is unfair. At a sort of almost instinctive sort of level. And I think that there is something pretty distinctive about Australia in terms of that. Sorry, I've lost your question.
Well, where do you think that comes from?
Well, look, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I think that sort of convict process, was obviously really formative in that. What was fair and what was not fair, and it was fundamentally unfair. I mean, it took on a separate sort of life during the whole sort of sporting process. The attachment to sport. What was fair on a playing field, what was fair in a game. Who was cheating on betting on horses or whatever. So there's a history of how that comes into being through that. But I think it's something that people can hang on to, because it's almost like a childish sort of attachment. When you're a little kid, you know, hey, that's not fair.
Yeah.
And so at its best, I think it's something that's really you can really build on. I mean, what we've seen though is fairness being used in a very partial sort of sense. I use this examples during COVID. Of the very partial fairness that attached. It's the sort of lifters and leaners. That the politicians like to talk about. Now, I think if there's a way of really trying to institute a sort of notion of fairness, very deeply and honestly, and recognising where the gaps are, that's a great tool. So I think that there is something really valuable and special about that idea that Australia has got a history of and has got a way of building on.
And COVID was a kind of grand moment of internal reflection as a country. The moment we all went, actually, we are going to stay inside and not, well, not all of us, but not fight back and stand up like the Americans did, and even in places like Europe. I think that was a moment where we really took the collective good side over the individualism side, maybe the fairness side over the freedom side. And you said that was a big reason of why you started to do this dive. What was that experience for you?
Well, I mean, partly, because I had, I've been doing Griffith Review for a long time, and we, each edition had a very different thematic sort of approach. And I mean, my intent with Griffith Review in those days was, I'd try and pick what was an issue that was emerging and find a way of surrounding it, so with historical stuff, with emotional stories, with reporting and so on, so that you could really get a sort of 360-degree view of whatever the issue was. And when we did issues which had an Australian very Australian theme, and we'd do events at writers' festivals and stuff, and I just kept this constant refrain is, I no longer know what it means to be Australian. I've sort of lost my bearings. I don't really quite understand it anymore. And it's not that I'm opposed to sort of, the changing population. It's not that I'm opposed to, the innovation. It's not that I'm opposed to being part of the globe. I've just sort of lost a sense of my moorings. And I kept on having that conversation with people. So what I discovered when I the thing that made me, in a way, decide to write the book was that I'd been playing around with these ideas for a long time. Then all of a sudden my life, like everyone's, just sort of had to grind to a halt. And I was lucky, I had a job that I could, kept on getting paid for, so that was nice. But I couldn't travel and I couldn't do a lot of the things that I'd previously been doing, so I was much less busy. And I realised sort of very early on in the sort of COVID process that it provided a good X-ray of the society, that it revealed the strengths and the weaknesses. And there were really good things that were shown, and there were some pretty nasty things that were shown as well. And for me, the sort of starting point was the exercise that happened late in January of 2020, when 2020, when the disease was starting to become apparent. And the Australian government arranged for, I think, a couple of planes to go to Wuhan in China and bring back Australian citizens or Australian permanent residents who were in Wuhan who needed to come home. Now, that was good. It was proactive. It was, it was on the problem. It was, addressing
humane,
it was humane. It was treating people, citizens properly. All of that sort of thing. But then the weird thing was they sent them to Christmas Island. So rather than saying, "Hey, you guys live in Sydney, we'll take over Sydney Olympic Park and we'll put you in, the hotels out there, and you'll be close to major hospitals because who knows, you might have this terrible disease." You put them on Christmas Island, which is like 4 or 5 hours from Perth. So it was sort of like the generosity and the appropriate response was there at one level. But then what do? You're treating them like they're asylum seekers, and you're putting them on a remote island. I mean, it just seemed to me that went to the contradiction of, the good and the bad in Australia in a way. That you knew what you had to do and you did it, almost you got it right. And then you didn't. And so I just saw lots of examples of that playing out, then over the next year, And so the instinct was good if you could actually do it, and then it would get stuffed up. And so I just thought it was a really good sort of, it provided a useful metaphor for thinking about the society, and it revealed a lot. And I mean, the sort of longer arc of it, because I finished the book just, when did it come out? In 22, so I'd done it it was before that election. And what had become very apparent to me, and this was before that Teal election or the community independence election, what had become very apparent to me was that because people had been confined to their 5 kilometres, and they were actually having to deal with their neighbours and stuff in a way that they didn't normally, or had, because you'd be travelling to work or, whatever, that it wasn't at all surprising to me that the community independence movement got such a head of steam during that period, because people were actually paying attention to where they physically lived and the people who were nearby to them. So they were worried about climate, and they were worried about integrity, and they were worried about justice, and all the big motivations of that election, which had been let down by the government in such a spectacular sort of fashion. But it didn't surprise me because people were reconnecting, and that was one of the really good things that came out of that process. Yeah.
And I also think more generally in terms of social media and stuff, we've globalized so much and we've become such global citizens that I think a lot of people are searching now, but like, what actually makes me unique and what makes me special? I think that's why a desire to understand an Australian identity has been such a mainstream kind of thing at the moment.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing is that seeing what Trump has done in America has made people think, actually, we've got to really think about what it is that makes us different. And that's, I think, part of the sort of motivation at the moment as well, because, there used to be a lazy sort of, it's just sort of like we're a pale imitation of America. Actually, we're hugely different to America for a whole range of different reasons.
They could do with a lot of tall poppy syndrome.
They could do it, indeed. And a bit less adulation of celebrities.
Yeah.
But that I do think that what's happened there, and seeing the response, both the negative and the positive response, so the acquiescence that there's been in sort of elites to what Trump has done is extraordinary. Universities and law firms and media companies, people just bowing down and saying, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. But then the sort of on-the-ground opposition, and the whole No Kings movement and the sort of stuff that's happening on the ground, which is really interesting and important, like that to me is, I think that, who knows what will happen in America and who knows what Trump will do, but there is the prospect of a real renewal of that society that comes in opposition to that. And I think the same thing's happening all around the world. The Canadian response to Trump's madness has actually reasserted a notion of Canada as something that's very different to its southern neighbour. And it's not a it's not like what I say here. It's not an oi 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 sort of nationalism. It's actually an inclusive nationalism, which is what do we want to be, not what have we been forced to become. And so I think that this is a perfect moment for that sort of conversation in Australia as well. And it's sort of there, it's sort of happening on the ground, but it's not being led. There's not a political figure who's prepared to actually say we need to have hard conversations about what's good, what's not so good. And look, it may be that the Royal Commission provides a trigger for that as well here. That really sort of going back to first principles of what it is, how you find that sort of accommodation, how you make history and make sort of intercultural stuff normal in a society. It's different to sort of a multicultural thing where everyone's doing their own thing. It's the intercultural bit that's sort of really interesting of how you find that sort of accommodation.
Yeah, because it's in multiculturalism has become such a defining word in Australia, and John Howard kind of talks about, we don't want multiculturalism, we want Australian culture. And I wonder if within multiculturalism and all of its benefits it's brought, whether there is something in not saying like we should wipe out every other culture like maybe John Howard's suggesting, but saying what is it that makes us all one people with multiple cultures? What is that Australian element to it? What do you think that message is that a leader or anyone in society could bring forward to bring that conversation? What is the message of an aspirational Australia and an idea of an Australia that is more nuanced and true to
and it's
to
sort
us?
of outward looking and inclusive, and actually values human rights. I mean, it seems to me that they're the core things. I mean, one of the things that struck me, this sort of two things that I pick up on what you're saying. One of the things that struck me after the Bondi attack. And the governments responded by doing punitive things, banning marches, all that sort of stuff. On one level, you understand that desire to punish, the desire to actually shut things down, because this was a terrible sort of assault on not just the sort of Jewish community, but on the nation as a whole. It was just a terrible thing. And one of the things that really struck me was that Australia has never adopted the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's never adopted a bill or an act which is setting out what the human rights are of people who live in this country. It's not there in the Constitution. It's not there. It's there in bits of legislation here and there, but there's not an overarching thing. And part of the argument about why it had never happened was that there was never a political moment which was so serious that you actually needed to actually articulate the human rights of Australians in legislation. And it seemed to me that Bondi, once the horror and the pain of it subsides, provides that sort of moment that it says, actually, if we're going to be punishing bad behaviour, let's start off with articulating what we aspirationally see as good behaviour. What are the rights that we think that people who live in this country have as an intrinsic human right? Once you've established that, you can punish the bad behaviour. You can outlaw stuff very much more effectively because everyone's got a shared view of what it actually means. So at one level, I come back to a sort of legislative sort of thing that says this is a moment when we need a Human Rights Act in this country which is contemporary and expansive and inclusive and says to everyone that this is what it takes to belong. It's not rule of law or Australian values or, waffly stuff. What does it actually mean in really practical, down-to-earth terms? Now, that would seem to me to be a really good starting point for that sort of conversation. Historically, it's been rejected in Australia because the states thought that a national human rights thing would diminish their rights. That's gone now. That's no longer an impulse that was once there. Queensland and Victoria and the ACT have had human rights acts that have been accepted by both Conservative and Labor governments for a considerable period of time. The polling now says that something like 80%, 87% of the population thinks there should be such an act in Australia. And you've, in a funny sort of way, the rise of the libertarian right and their attachment to freedom of speech and all the rest of it actually provides a platform for it as well. So that would seem to me to be a very practical political way that you could actually drive that conversation. You could say, we're actually going to define in legislation what human rights mean in Australia. and we're going to introduce an act. And, there were 3 Australians who are actively involved in drafting that UN Declaration of Human Rights. We still haven't done it. This is a chance to do it. So that would be one way that I think that you could use the negatives of the moment to actually say, let's take it to another level. And really, what parliaments do is legislation. Let's find a way of doing this. So that would be one way that I think you could actually politically use this time to actually just redefine things.
And I think you could almost do it in a more Australian way than, the American way of, you have freedom to do whatever you want. I think we value freedom from a lot more here. You actually have freedom from people going out of their way with guns to harm you in the street. They don't really address that freedom in America. It's all freedom to own a gun.
That's right.
Not freedom
it's the individual. It's the individual rather than the collective. Yeah,
the collective freedom from those kind of collective of good that we have in Australia. So
yeah, I think, and it's also about. I mean, I think one of the things that is not uniquely Australian, but distinctively Australian, is the sort of sense that the government oughta. The government oughta do this, whatever it might be. And that goes right back, because it goes back to the sort of settlement process, that you had to wait for stuff to come from London. So the government oughta, it's really deep in the culture. And so I think that moving beyond that to, because, a declaration of rights implies responsibilities as well. And it also imposes on governments a way of behaving appropriately. And so you've seen that now, most dramatically, I guess, with the robo-debt, process, that the government didn't behave appropriately, and it deliberately didn't behave appropriately, or the agencies of government didn't behave appropriately. So, a legislative framework to that, would be really important. I mean, it pops up in weird ways. I've, in recent times, had a bit to do with the aged care system. The new Aged Care Act, it starts with these wonderful declarations of the rights of the older person, the right to be consulted, the right to be involved, blah, blah, blah. It's all lovely. Then the back end of the legislation is all about establishing a market, and so there's a real tension in that. So I think in all of these little areas, you can actually go to something which, you ask a question of what could a politician do? Well, I think that's what a politician could do, is actually really do the serious work about thinking about what a rights framework might look like, and then, you start to have that conversation. There was a parliamentary inquiry which came up with these recommendations before the last election, and I think there's something like 400 groups that have signed up to this campaign. So there's a sort of thing that's happening on the ground, but getting the political traction is what you need to actually take it to the next level.
And looking forward, are you hopeful? How do you feel about us as a nation?
Look, I think this is an enormously wonderful place. I think it's got enormous benefits, and I think that it's got great people, great institutions, but I think we need to be a bit braver, a bit more courageous, a bit more willing to go back to first principles so that you're actually finding solutions rather than just putting Band-Aids on things as you go along. And so I think the courage and the boldness of doing that. There are plenty of lessons from history of how that's happened, and I think there's enormous potential. I worry that we're being too timid and that we're not being rigorous enough in trying to pursue that, and that we slip into a sort of an individualistic thing. I think the great strength of Australia is that collective stuff, and if we can help encourage politicians and others to find the courage to do that, that will be to our advantage.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm so pleased you like the book.
Julianne is someone that I really admire. She thinks so deeply and articulates so well the things that she's trying to say. So I would highly recommend anyone read this book, and I would recommend you also check out her column for The Guardian. I just want to finish off the episode by reading out something from the final page of the book. Goes, "Be bold, be bold, be bold. Reform is hard, but worth it. Adopting this ambition and applying the values of respect and truthfulness, imagination, fairness, and egalitarianism would be a start. Platitudes and myths are not enough. A fully formed nation grounded in a civic, not ethnic way of belonging, without fear, is still possible. The soul of the nation has a rich inner life. It holds the dreams and stories of those who have always been here and those who have come in waves ever since. Thank you for listening. I have been David Thom with original music by Anya Haywood.